On the 24th of February, Russia's invasion of Ukraine began with rapid advances and combined arms operations. On the first day, it was announced that airborne troops had landed at Hostomel Airport and that the Russians were making a play for Kyiv. By March the 2nd, Russia announced that Kherson had been taken. This was modern mobile war, or at least it was meant to be. It would be announced that between the 24th of February and the 2nd of March, Russian troops had moved more than 100 kilometres and seized the city of Kherson. Jump forward to December, and between the 3rd and the 10th, Wagner troops to the southeast of Bakhmut would advance about 250 metres and seize the city garbage dump. As advances in Ukraine slow down and more images come out that look more like 1917 than 2022, it's clear that in some ways war never changes, and that both sides sometimes struggle to deal with an old problem. Determined infantry dug into complex trench systems or fortifications who set their flag in place and refused to move. At places like Bakhmut, Russian infantry, artillery and aviation struggle to make advances measured in meters per day. Just like Western Front battles more than a century ago, Bakhmut consumes men and materiel at a prodigious rate, and just like those battles, many are left wondering what the purpose of it all is. And to be fair, that's a complex question, and one a lot less flashy than analysing the performance of helicopters or air defence systems. But understanding this world of grinding attrition, positional fighting, trenches and fortifications is, I think, critical to understanding the war in Ukraine so far, and as such, worthy of our attention. So what am I going to be talking about today? First, I'm going to try and track the development of the Ukraine war from its mobile stage to the current stage where there is a growing emphasis on entrenchment by the Russians across the line and in places like Bakhmut by the Ukrainians in turn. Then, because it's impossible to do a video on this topic without talking about Bakhmut, I'm going to talk about both the fighting in Bakhmut and also an evaluation of its operational and strategic significance. Then I'm going to take some observations out of the fighting so far. What does this mean for entrenchment, breaching, and lessons that can go into other conflicts? As much as some people want to say this is just World War I fighting, for example, the troops in World War I did not have little quadcopter drones or precision-guided artillery shells at their beck and call. Finally, I'm going to look at what growing Russian entrenchment efforts mean for the war. What is the implication of them spending all of these resources building new fortifications like the so-called Wagner Line, and how might that impact the war to come? The first thing to say is that from a historical perspective, there's nothing unusual about the sort of developments that we're seeing in Ukraine right now. Humans figured out the whole digging thing pretty early in our recorded history, and military thinkers for millennia have understood that sweat and a good shovel can save a whole bunch of spilt blood. Roman soldiers spent considerably more time building fortifications or digging trenches and building camps than they ever did fighting on a battlefield. But the process of entrenchment became particularly critical as firearms and artillery began to improve. Humans are squishy beings, and as they got their hands on better and better weapon systems, it became more and more important not to get hit in the first place. And if you're trying not to get hit, digging a hole is a pretty good approach. World War I looked the way it did in part because on a battlefield dominated by heavy machine guns and rapid-firing artillery, humans didn't want to die, and so they dug trenches. And as the war went on, they dug more and more complex trenches protected by barbed wire, landmines, and other defensive fortifications. Now, overcoming such fortifications in a way that minimises friendly casualties has always been a specialised role, and I'm not a combat engineer, so I'm very thankful to one who agreed to consult in the preparation of this presentation. Sergeant Cates is a combat engineer with the United States Marine Corps, and his contribution to this presentation has been invaluable. I'll be including some of his observations as we move through the presentation. Given the hell that was World War I trench fighting, it's perhaps not surprising the militaries around the world spent the interwar years trying to come up with ways to get around the trench hell problem. Improvements in armour, in aircraft, in combined arms tactics gave armies a way to restore mobility. And so World War II and later conflicts gave us plenty of examples of successful manoeuvre. Some of the great encirclements of the Second World War, Israeli victory in 1967, or the US and coalition victory in 1991 stand out as examples. Saddam's forces in 1991 were deeply entrenched, and it made almost no difference to the outcome. The Iraqis simply couldn't match the sheer scope of capabilities possessed by the coalition. But all these dramatic victories carry with them a little bit of a warning. Combined arms offensives are difficult, and if the resources and capabilities available aren't up to the task, there's always a danger of war reverting to static attritional fighting. The Israeli armoured forces that had dashed forward in 1967 ran into real difficulties against entrenched Egyptian infantry with ATGMs in 1973. And when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran with thousands of armoured vehicles expecting a quick victory, the result was static attritional trench fighting, a World War I analogue fought in the 1980s. And in some ways we've seen that historical process play out on a couple of fronts in Ukraine. Although in Ukraine the difference was the war essentially began in a fortified state, especially in the Donbass. Between 2014 and 2022, both sides built up a system of fortifications in Donetsk and Luhansk, and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians would rotate through this system of trenches and bunkers between 2014 and 2022. And in many ways it was because of the presence of these fortifications as well as regular Ukrainian army units that when the Russians and the DNR-LNR forces attacked in the Donbass on the 24th of February, the attacks basically went nowhere. Pro-Russian sources, particularly those aligned with the Donbass proxies, described the early attacks in February and March as extremely expensive holding actions that racked up massive casualties for Russia's proxy forces and for the Russian troops themselves, and were intended to buy time for the attack on Kyiv. But across the rest of Ukraine, we were seeing manoeuvre warfare, Russian advances that were measured in kilometres per day. There were the thunder runs by light forces, there were armoured spearheads, there was the airborne operation towards Kyiv. An attempt, I would argue, to knock out the Ukrainian government early through rapid manoeuvre. Ultimately, however, these tactics would fail as Ukrainian cities proved very difficult to capture and Russian supply lines became overextended. Russian units facing Kyiv, for example, faced incredibly intense Ukrainian artillery fire, as well as having supply lines that stretched all the way back to Belarus and which weren't properly protected. The ultimate result was a goodwill gesture back across the Belarusian border and an end to the initial phase of Russian manoeuvre operations. When Russia began its next offensive in the Donbass, it wasn't with sweeping manoeuvre, but instead slow, grinding artillery bombardments followed by infantry and armour assaults. The reason I highlight this is because it seems that as Russia's perceived military advantage over Ukraine decreased, its tendency away from manoeuvre and towards fires and positional fighting increased. Shock and awe is great, but not when you have an inadequate supply of shock and or awe. And the change in Russian tactics did suffice to take the cities of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. But despite all the discussion at the time, there was no great follow-up offensive to push on to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Instead, the introduction of HIMARS, the progress of Ukrainian mobilization, Russia's manpower issues, all combined to make a serious difference at the front. Russia's advantage in relative combat power declined, to the point where Ukraine was actually able to retake the initiative and start launching its own offensives at Kharkiv and Kherson, the former of which was a good example of manoeuvre enabled by inadequate combat power on the part of the Russians. The Ukrainians identified weaknesses in the Russian line, and they ruthlessly exploited them. At Kherson, where the resources available to both sides were much more even, Ukraine, like Russia, took a slow and methodical approach. At the time of recording, the Russian army seems to mostly be on the defensive in Ukraine. Pro-Russian sources describe most fronts as preparing for what is essentially a passive defence, and we've seen more and more evidence of Russia building defensive belts and fortifications in lines going all the way back to and including Crimea, and indeed in some cases, even in Russian territory. The image you can see on the screen there is admittedly of a fairly basic line of fortifications, but still one of the more extensive lines of fortification we've seen constructed so far. And it's being constructed to defend the Russian city of Belgorod. And just in case you think I'm judging that based on random internet commentary, that's a post by Vyacheslav Gladkov, who is the governor of Belgorod Oblast. Now, these sort of fortifications might suggest a prudent defensive mindset for an army that is trying to buy time to reconstitute itself for a potential future offensive. But the line between prudence and paranoia gets a little bit strained when you hear that they're preparing defences on Crimean beaches. Now look, I believe it is important not to underestimate the Ukrainian military, but I think it's a stretch to think they're on the cusp of an amphibious landing in Crimea. And you could argue it suggests a lack of confidence in the Russian Black Sea Fleet to fight off even a country which doesn't really have any major surface warships. But jokes aside, the key point here is that at most places on the front, and indeed at some places well behind the front, Russia is putting in place preparations for static defensive fighting. But then, as with almost any pattern, there is an exception. Bakhmut is an anomaly in the overall strategic picture. Whereas everywhere else along the line, Russia is generally on the defensive, at Bakhmut, Russia remains constantly, relentlessly on the attack. And this is no half-hearted effort. Every single day, Russian bombardment of Ukrainian positions is intense. Bombardment is followed by infantry assaults along multiple axes of advance, followed by more bombardment. Whereas almost everywhere else across the front, the Russians have given off signs of wanting to conserve resources, at Bakhmut, they have poured in men and materiel constantly, day after day, in a grinding war of attrition. Russian sources have openly compared this effort to the World War I fight at Verdun. And the stories and images to come out of Bakhmut, where trenches, fortifications, and determined defenders have held back the full might of the Russian army, have captured international attention. So let's talk about the battle for Bakhmut. And the best way to do that is to start with a quick timeline, because the battle for Bakhmut didn't begin 2 weeks ago. It's been a going concern for months. In a way that's easy to understand given Russia's stated campaign objectives. Long before there was any mention of Zaporizhia or Kherson, at the stage where Vladimir Putin was still saying that Russia wasn't in this for a land grab and had no interest in any territory, the so-called protection of the people of the Donbass was a key Russian stated objective, and Bakhmut, as part of Donetsk Oblast, is in the Donbass. After the objective of toppling the entire Ukrainian government failed, Russia refocused on the Donbass as a core objective, allegedly working to an internal August to September deadline for taking both all of Donetsk and all of Luhansk. As a side note, the argument that the invasion was to protect the people of the Donbass from shelling has never made much sense to me. When the Russians look for proof that thousands of people became casualties as a result of shelling, they bring up the reports by the UN observation missions. But those same reports show that in 2021, 25 civilians in total would die in the Donbass as a result of conflict-related activities. That includes people on both sides of the line of control, including in Ukrainian territory, and most of those were actually lost to mines as opposed to artillery shelling. In 2020, the number was 26. In 2019, the number was 27. Now, those numbers obviously still represent individual tragedies, but when you're more likely to have been murdered in Moscow than killed by shelling in the Donbass, you really have to ask the question of whether a military operation was necessary, especially since after February 24th, 2022, something like 4,000 civilians have been killed in Donetsk and Luhansk. In other words, the operation that Russia claims was designed to protect civilians in these areas has actually succeeded in increasing losses by about 200 times. In the early stages of the war, the fighting wasn't around the city of Bakhmut itself. Instead, places like Severodonetsk and Lysychansk took the brunt of the fighting. The key point that guaranteed that Bakhmut probably would become a frontline city came in May, when the Russians and their allies were able to take Popasna. Now, Popasna, which you can see on the bottom right of that image on the right-hand side of the screen, was a very heavily fortified position and probably also the site of some of the heaviest Russian shelling seen anywhere during this war. Ukrainian troops who fought both at Popasna and now in Bakhmut say there is no comparison, as hellish as it is, between the shelling that now lands on Bakhmut and what was landing at Popasna. Because this is before the introduction of HIMARS and the threat to forward Russian ammunition positions. With the fall of Popasna, the defense of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk on the top right-hand corner of the screen became very difficult because there was a mechanism for the Russians to get behind those cities and cut them off. Now, once it became obvious that Severodonetsk and Lysychansk were going to fall to the Russians, both Western and Russian media latched onto the idea that the next great battle would be for the cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, and with it, the battle for the whole of Donetsk Oblast. The places in between, Siversk, Bakhmut, weren't really considered that much. But with the introduction of HIMARS and expansion of Ukrainian combat power and a depletion of Russian resources, that line ended up holding. And line really is the key word there, because even though all the attention focuses on Bakhmut itself, which was a city of about 70,000 people before the war, it's actually just part of a defensive line. A critical part, to be sure, but the defense of which would be impossible without holding actions in other towns and cities scattered along the defense to the north and south. Bakhmut is so hard to take in part because it's got relatively well-protected supply lines running to the west and northwest. Those supply lines are protected because places like Soledar have held up against attacks for months. Basically, what I'm saying is when I tell the story of Bakhmut, I could equally be telling the story of Opitne, or of Soledar, and that if I was a Ukrainian soldier defending one of those locations, when they eventually stamp out campaign medals, I really hope they're not forgotten. But as you know, I focus less on the specifics of individual battles and more on large-scale observations and implications, so we'll use Bakhmut itself for illustrative purposes. Just keep in mind that when I do talk about Bakhmut, I could equally be talking in many cases about other defensive positions along this line. It's not like trench digging is some secret technique known only to the defenders of Bakhmut. The other thing to note is that while the Russian army is fighting at Bakhmut, the Wagner PMC is at the forefront of the battle. Prigozhin, as we've talked about before, is a bit of an interesting character. After spending nearly a decade in prison during the era of the Soviet Union for robbery and fraud and other crimes, he eventually became a close friend of Vladimir Putin and made his money basically running catering contracts to the Russian government and military. Having made a massive fortune for reasons that had everything to do with his business acumen and absolutely nothing to do with corruption, Prigozhin did the only natural thing for anyone who's successful in the catering business. He started a mercenary company. Members of the now famous Wagner group like to refer to themselves as members of the orchestra or musicians, but these are some pretty bloody well-armed musicians with their own tanks, artillery, and even combat aircraft and pilots. I guess a howitzer is kind of a percussion instrument if you stretch the definition far enough. This isn't just some mob of former prisoners given a Kalashnikov and told to charge. And the group is special in other ways as well. PMCs are banned in Russia, which is why the group openly operates and has a massive headquarters. They are not at all linked to the Russian government, which is why the Russian government doesn't have to take responsibilities for their more questionable actions on deployments in Africa and elsewhere, which is why the group enjoys unparalleled access to modern armor, artillery, and military equipment from Russian factories. And Prigozhin's shadow army has taken public responsibility and ownership for the battle at Bakhmut. And pro-Wagner sources are often quick to comment that it is only here, in a place where Wagner is in the lead, that Russia is still taking any ground. Perhaps because their reputation is now tied up in the success of the battle for Bakhmut, Wagner has been sending infantry assaults against Bakhmut basically daily for months now. And the results, as we'll see in a moment, are battles not for kilometres of territory or for entire cities, but for streets or individual buildings. At the time of recording, the battle for Bakhmut continues, albeit in something of a state of transition and flux. The Russians are still attacking daily. Indeed, attacks have intensified compared to a month ago due to additional Wagner reinforcements and also troops brought in from the Kherson front. Many military analysts have suggested the Russian plan might be to try and cut Bakhmut off, go to the north and south, cut off the supply lines into the city, and force the Ukrainians to withdraw that way. But at the same time, the Russians have continued to launch attacks directly into the teeth of Ukrainian defences themselves, and as at time of recording, fighting is ongoing inside some buildings of Bakhmut itself. Now, that major push by the Russians has coincided with a moment of vulnerability for the Ukrainians. Most of the units that were defending Bakhmut had been there for months, some of them without rotation for months, heavily depleted, very tired, very used to and adept at defending their locations, but in desperate need of rest. The Ukrainians have rotated several units in recent weeks, pulling the tired and exhausted ones out of Bakhmut and replacing them with new ones redeployed from other fronts. I don't normally cite specific brigades, but just about everyone knows by now that the 93rd Mechanized was one of the key Ukrainian formations defending Bakhmut. They have now been rotated out and replaced by other units. Rotation is often a point of vulnerability for a defensive force because you're bringing units that have been entrenched in an area for a while off the line and having to go through the complex dance of replacing them under enemy pressure. During the rotation, therefore, we did see some not insignificant advances on the Russian side, or, well, not insignificant by the standards of Bakhmut. These are still advances measured in hundreds of meters. But as of now, the fight seems to retain its typical character of a slow, relentless grind. But while the fighting around Bakhmut has been attritional for months now, that doesn't mean the way the war is being fought there hasn't evolved. So I thought I'd take a quick look at some of the features that have defined the fighting here over time. And the first feature to mention is that entrenchment has been incredibly important in Bakhmut, trenches and prepared defences, but it's by no means the most heavily fortified location in Ukraine, far from it. If you look at satellite imagery of Bakhmut taken in 2020 or 2021, you won't see vast interconnected trench systems. You'll see the occasional defensive earthworks, but nothing particularly grandiose. Ukrainian veterans whose units fought at Bakhmut earlier in the war talk about moving up not into prepared positions, but having to entrench themselves. It wasn't a warren of deep concrete bunkers and saunas. It was whatever trenches their units could dig themselves. Given that, it's perhaps not surprising that some of the strongest defensive positions at Bakhmut are anchored not on individual trench systems, but on industrial buildings or terrain features. The trench lines usually make up forward defensive positions, not the final point of resistance. From what I can put together from both the Russian and Ukrainian sources, the initial battles for Bakhmut followed what is more of a traditional Russian assault model, mechanized attacks with significant artillery support. There was obviously very heavy usage of tube and rocket artillery to pound defensive positions, but because Bakhmut is so close to the front, it was also more practical for the Russians to lean on fixed-wing and rotary-winged aviation to provide additional fire support during these initial offensives. And often those offensives would include cooperation between armour and infantry, with vehicles participating in the attack itself. In a recent interview, a Ukrainian artillery commander who had been to Bakhmut credited the arrival of precision artillery, specifically the Excalibur guided 155mm round from places like Canada and the United States, with adjusting the Russian plan somewhat, because the precise ability to knock out armoured assets close to the front encouraged the Russians to move their armour and artillery and whatnot further back. That led to a transition to a more infantry-based model of assault. This is reflected in a lot of the visual evidence that's coming out of Bakhmut from both sides. Less footage of things like tank engagements and mechanized assaults, and more small infantry actions by Wagner assault teams. By all accounts, these attacks are continuous. Both sides more or less agree on that. They happen day in and day out, striking from multiple directions, always trying to find a weak point in defences that can be exploited. I've seen some people suggest that these are basically human wave attacks by untrained disposable prisoners. The evidence we have available to us suggests it's really a lot more than that, or at least that's how I'd read the evidence available. While there are certainly mobilised personnel and low-grade troops present, those Ukrainians who have been interviewed don't seem to give those units particularly much offensive credit, but they make some interesting observations about the Wagner assault units themselves. As far as the Ukrainians have been able to discern, Wagner assault tactics follow a pretty set playbook. First, multiple small groups of infantry are formed, 8 to 20-something men, and routes for each individual group are plotted on what is basically the equivalent of Google Maps. This is a very detailed assault plan, position to position of the route you will follow into the target area. The reasoning here is pretty simple. It allows an attack to guarantee that units will focus on potential weak spots or areas of interest, and that also takes tactical decision-making freedom away from the troops that are doing it. They don't have to make any complex decisions about where they go, they just have to follow the plan. Before the groups go in, there will be a preparatory bombardment, and then the assault groups will move in on foot, with fire support provided by automatic grenade launchers and mortars. Those assault groups will then try to break into Ukrainian defensive positions, seizing them in close quarters fighting and creating a breach that can be exploited by follow-on waves. If an attack fails by contrast, well then whatever positions are revealed during the attack, so whatever Ukrainian defensive positions fire on the attackers and kill them, those will then be subjected to a heavier bombardment than the one that preceded the first attack. Everything will be reset, and you go again. Now if that sounds to anyone here like World War I tactics, well, you're not alone. Pro-Russian sources, and even sources linked to Wagner itself, openly compare themselves to German stormtroopers from the First World War. There's a quote from an account there that uses a quote that says, "The bullet is a mad thing, only the bayonet knows what it is about," which is a quote by Suvorov, one of the great Russian generals of all time. The problem, of course, is that Suvorov died in 1800, which means that the tactical inspiration that they're using here is a couple of centuries out of date. Wagner takes open pride in not really paying much heed to casualties, and since retreating without orders is allegedly cause for execution, these teams do tend to push their assaults to the end. And if you thought the World War I comparisons were over, Ukrainian tactics are a blast from the past as well. In their ideal form, the Ukrainians around Bakhmut will have a frontline trench, a tripwire position that they don't over-invest in holding. When a bombardment starts or an attack is being built, individuals might fall back to a second line. The attack is then ideally absorbed while artillery is brought to bear on the attackers, and then there's a localized counterattack to take back whatever was lost from the exhausted attackers. That approach reduces artillery casualties, but it does help explain why occasionally small incremental gains can be made. If the counterattack fails to throw out the assault group, well then that can ossify as a new Russian position. I would note, however, that those sound like very idealized tactics, and in a context where the fighting is now, at least in some cases, taking place within towns and cities themselves, I do wonder how often this sort of idea can be used fully. In any case, it's important to remember that these infantry attacks, time and time again, day after day, with their great cost for the attackers and not insignificant cost for the defenders, are not being fought over kilometres of ground. They're being fought over metres, over individual buildings. Like historical urban battles, places like Bakhmut have key defensible features and landmarks, buildings that are easier to fortify, reinforce or defend, and those are repeatedly contested. Those who follow the war on TV will be used to seeing that omnipresent feature of modern war reporting, the map with the arrows on it, arrows that often encompass entire towns or swaths of territory, covering a recent advance. For those who are following Bakhmut day by day, individual terrain features have become known to all. If I say the gas station or the drywall factory or the garbage dump, someone who is following this battle knows exactly what I mean. The gas station, for example, is the Alpha gas station northeast of Bakhmut. You can see it there on the map and also from some drone footage on the right. This is a location that has produced endless examples of footage of drone-dropped grenades and artillery strikes on Russian positions, as the location is occupied and bombarded again and again and again. I'd actually advise some viewer discretion in looking those videos up, because you can only see so many drone-dropped grenade videos before it all starts to weigh on you a bit. The garbage dump is exactly what it says on the tin, and it's on the southeast corner of Bakhmut. Earlier this month, Russian infantry were able to definitively secure the site, leading to a burst of reporting across the internet. But what a lot of that reporting, not all, but what a lot of that reporting missed is that the garbage dump had been fought over before. While some would joke that it was ironic that a group of Russian soldiers would give their lives in order to seize a garbage dump, the reality is they weren't the first. The garbage dump had previously been fought over in October, when Russian troops took it for a short period and were then reportedly thrown back by a Ukrainian counterattack. This is Bakhmut, where even a garbage dump is fought over tooth and nail for months. The fact that it might take weeks and hundreds of casualties to seize an individual building or landmark points to the intense difficulty of digging entrenched infantry out of a fortified position. Even with a significant Russian superiority in artillery, and by this point literally months of bombardment, it takes determined infantry assaults to displace the Ukrainian defenders. To paraphrase Sergeant Cates, no matter how much you bombard a position, eventually a grunt has to go in. Short of dropping copious amounts of artillery and other munitions on a position, if a structure needs to be taken, someone has to make entry. And as the battle for Bakhmut is proving, if a position is sufficiently fortified, like a basement or a heavy industrial structure, even a copious amount of artillery might not do the job. And that meant ongoing infantry assaults that, while they were clearly dangerous, were extremely expensive in terms of casualties. A more recent development noted by one Ukrainian commander was the use of infiltration tactics at night. These basically involve small groups of relatively elite Wagnerites or recon units from the Russian military or Spetsnaz, equipped with thermal imaging equipment, attempting to creep up on Ukrainian positions and then stage basically short-range rapid infiltration assaults under the cover of darkness. Now, on the surface, this makes sense. You're far less likely to be killed on the approach if it's nighttime and most of the defenders don't have night vision or thermal images. Coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan know what an advantage owning the night can be. But while there is some circumstantial evidence for this, like the alleged spotting of Spetsnaz units around Bakhmut, it's going to take a while before we have enough evidence to conclude the role these tactics played in any recent advances, or indeed to what extent these tactics are actually being employed. Thermal images are expensive and a great opportunity for corrupt supply officers to make some cash online, so they're constantly in short supply at the front. In closing out this discussion of some of the features of the Bakhmut fighting, I thought I'd also tackle some quick myths. The first is that Bakhmut is just a fight by Wagner. It's not. Wagner is a lot of the combat potential around Bakhmut, but you have regular Russian army units and Spetsnaz units there as well, providing artillery support, providing logistics support, and indeed providing some of the infantry power. I've also seen some pretty fanciful casualty claims, and I use that word very deliberately. If I ever talk about the information war in Ukraine more, I'll discuss the so-called spectrum of information between various sources, with basically saying that you have the Ministry of Defense for Russia and Ukraine on opposite ends, but beyond that, at even more extreme positions, you have people on the internet who are basically cheerleaders who come up with the most insane stuff possible for consumption by foreign audiences. And a recent example of this is, from what I can tell based on one short clip on Telegram, people started talking about the Ukrainians suffering between 500 and 1,000 KIA per day in Bakhmut. Now that figure is obviously bullshit. It's far higher than what the Russian MOD would claim, it's higher than what the Wagner linked channels would claim, and if it was that high, every single Ukrainian defender in Bakhmut has been killed multiple times over. Casualties in Bakhmut are obviously very heavy, but you could probably safely divide that number by 10 and be significantly closer to the truth. The idea of this being a battle between hordes of Wagner prisoners and Ukrainian regulars, also really false. Both sides have very mixed forces in Bakhmut. The Ukrainians have TDF, regular special forces units, and the Russians have, well, mobilized personnel, Wagner prisoners, more regular Wagner troops, regular Russian troops, and some Spetsnaz units as well. It's mixed forces all around. The town isn't just an artillery trap. The Russians aren't just pounding Ukrainian positions and not doing any infantry work. They're sending infantry assaults every day, and both Russian and Ukrainian sources agree on that. There are no massive Polish legions in Bakhmut. I've seen this one a lot from some of the Zania pro-Russian sources that argue that there are thousands of Polish casualties in Bakhmut. There aren't. And finally, there's no inexorable advance here. Russia isn't gaining a certain amount of territory every day. It's in fits and starts. There are counterattacks. There's a general pattern of advance over the last couple of months, but it's not like they gain a set number of meters per day, as I've seen it characterized. Instead, it is just an incredibly expensive, ongoing offensive that has taken some ground overall, but has also stalled for significant periods. Now, most people listening to this probably have the same question. Why? Why, despite the fact that Russia has generally gone on the defensive everywhere else on the line, is it deciding to expend so much effort trying to take Bakhmut? Now, make no mistake, in the earlier stages of the war, seizing Bakhmut made perfect sense. 8 months ago now, we were talking about how Bakhmut would soon fall and it would enable a Russian offensive on the cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Congratulations to Sky News there, you put the Ukrainian flags there for the cities in the wrong spot. The cities are in fact where the little explosive icons go. And the reason Russians would want Sloviansk and Kramatorsk is because if the political objective is to take the Donbass, which means all of Donetsk and all of Luhansk, well, Sloviansk and Kramatorsk are major urban agglomerations in Donetsk and they have to be taken. In order to take them, if you seize Bakhmut, then you can attack Sloviansk and Kramatorsk from multiple directions at once. From the north at Izium, but then also from the east. So 8 months ago, the assumption in a lot of the mainstream media was that after the fall of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, Bakhmut would fall and the Russians would push in on Sloviansk and Kramatorsk from the south, from the east, and from the north. But of course, as you all know, Russia isn't in Izium anymore. The Kharkiv counteroffensive pushed the Russians out of Izium and Liman. And as a result, Bakhmut now has a lot less value than it did at that time. And of course, as Bakhmut became less important, the attacks on it increased in severity, leading to certain Russian commentators, people like Strelkov, to comment that the Russian strategy basically seemed to be to smash their foreheads repeatedly into the teeth of Ukraine's hardest defences. And that characterization isn't entirely unfair. Bakhmut is a difficult location to take. It's an urban agglomeration, it has some high ground, it's got a river going through it, it's now been heavily fortified. So why on earth continue to smash infantry forces into it again and again when it no longer has the same value that it once did? Now obviously it's impossible for us to know for sure. The decision-making of Russian command isn't known to the general public. But a couple of ideas have been advanced as potential explanations for why Bakhmut. The first is that this is still the same old plan. Bakhmut needs to be taken because the goal is to take the Donbass, and taking Bakhmut opens up the rest of Donetsk to eventually be taken. The second idea, which is the one that's now advanced by Prigozhin himself publicly, is the idea here was never to take Bakhmut. Bakhmut is secondary. The goal here is just to inflict attrition on Ukrainian forces by shelling them and destroying them in place. Basically the German plan at Verdun. And we all know how well that worked out. The third idea that is often advanced is that it's just about domestic and international marketing and politics. That it's about showing that Russia is still advancing, that it's a point of pride, or that it's about political influence for Prigozhin, as opposed to any sort of military necessity. Now, I can't prove or disprove any of these explanations. I'm not privy to Russian decision-making. I don't know what the actual driving argument is. But what I can do is look at each of them in turn and ask a simple question. Is the attack on Bakhmut worth it in relation to that objective? And a response that is both glib and terrifying would be to say, well, perhaps it is worth it because we're talking about it. Besides the missile strikes, Bakhmut absorbs an immense amount of attention inside and outside of Russia. It's what a lot of the coverage on the Ukraine war is about, which means we're focused on the one area where Russia is still attacking, where Russia still has the initiative. We're not talking about further north in Luhansk. We're not talking about what's happening down south in Zaporizhia. We're talking about the one area where Russia can still show that it's making some gains. Now, it's pretty horrifying to think that a government might voluntarily sacrifice thousands of lives as part of a media strategy, but I thought I'd make the observation. So far as the argument that Bakhmut still retains some operational value and is worth taking, there's some merit in that basic argument. It would simplify supply lines for the Russians, it would complicate them for the Ukrainians. It's likely a prerequisite for most of the realistic scenarios in which the Russians eventually get to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. It might endanger some of the other settlements along the current defense line. So, for example, it might eventually be used to endanger Siversk further north and allow the Russians to make further gains elsewhere. But all of those scenarios are pretty big asks. In all of those scenarios, taking Bakhmut, which is expensive and exhausting, is just the first step. It involves a series of additional attacks on other fortified targets in order to achieve the desired result. Regarding the idea the objective is attrition, this is what Prigozhin has publicly said, that the intention is to bleed the Ukrainian military out in Bakhmut, and that's basically the Verdun logic. Pick an object that the enemy will defend and inflict disproportionate casualties by forcing them to defend that object. The issue I have with this is that Bakhmut's a pretty bad target if the goal is to inflict disproportionate attrition relative to the resources you put in. It's kind of hard to score a positive ratio on casualties when your chosen tactic is infantry Zerg rushes into fortified positions. In order to compensate for the advantages a defender enjoys by being dug in, the Russians have to employ very large amounts of artillery to help equalize the score, so to speak. And that's a limited resource in terms of barrels, ammunition, and logistical capability. Plus, despite there being some outlying claims out there, I'm relatively confident on the data that's available from both pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian sources that Russia is taking considerably more casualties in Bakhmut than the Ukrainians are. And that's not usually a good formula for winning an attritional exchange, particularly one that you voluntarily choose to enter into. The final argument is the attacks may be political, and Prigozhin has certainly built his public profile with the fighting in Bakhmut. For Putin, the battle helps head off criticism that not enough is being done to help the people in the Donbass or to gain territory there, because it shows the Russian army and Wagner are still actively fighting for the Donbass. In terms of casualties, well, the casualties may politically not really matter. They're Wagner casualties, not Russian army casualties. These aren't Russian army conscripts, these are prisoners, mercenaries, scum of the earth. What do the mothers of Russia care if a bunch of Wagner soldiers get killed? And so as horrifying as this idea is, I do think it makes a degree of sense. But here's the thing I think people miss when they talk about the potential significance or value of Bakhmut, when they say, oh, it does have some strategic value, therefore the Russians are perfectly reasonable in attacking it, for example. The question for me is not whether Bakhmut has any value, it's whether there is an opportunity cost involved here, because there is no source that will disagree with the argument that Russia has directed a lot of combat power towards Bakhmut. It's the focus for Wagner. When troops pulled out of Kherson, a number of them ended up here. It's where a lot of artillery ammunition expenditure is taking place. It's where a lot of casualties are occurring, assaulting a fortified position. So it's important not just to ask what Russia has achieved at Bakhmut, but what it could have achieved if those forces were used elsewhere instead. Again, I'm not an expert, but if the objective was to just attrit Ukrainians, you would think that Russia might concentrate its attacks on the places where Ukraine is attacking and is, as a result, not super heavily dug in and more vulnerable to artillery. If the goal had been all along to take Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, then the better idea would have been to not lose Izium and Liman, as opposed to spending everything trying to take Bakhmut. So in my view, and it is just my limited view, Bakhmut has been a mistake for the Russians. And here's my thesis. The commitment to Bakhmut has been asymmetric. The Russians have poured a lot more combat power into taking Bakhmut than the Ukrainians have pushed in to defend it. The Ukrainian troops there have sometimes complained about this. Ukrainian high command has remarked on it. Zaluzhny has apologized to the troops in the trenches at Bakhmut because time and time again, the Ukrainian high command has decided that instead of sending additional forces to Bakhmut, it will concentrate them and use them elsewhere. That's what happened at Kharkiv. That's what happened at Kherson. Those units could have gone to Bakhmut and reinforced the defences, but instead they were concentrated, they launched offensives, and those offensives secured thousands of square kilometres of territory and major cities like Kherson. Russian troops clearly have a local advantage in Bakhmut in terms of number of artillery pieces and the number of troops that they're bringing to bear. But Russian units also complain of being outmatched in terms of artillery and manpower elsewhere on the front. So that local superiority around Bakhmut comes at a cost elsewhere. And so to me as an observer, the rate of investment, the return on investment rather, just isn't there at Bakhmut. The Russians aren't getting a payoff equivalent to the resources that they put into the fight. The Russians are the guy who tries to win the $1 million jackpot in the lottery by buying $2 million worth of tickets. Which means either there's some critical data missing from our evaluation, the Russians are just stupid, or political decision-making is driving the decision to keep pushing on Bakhmut long after it has lost a lot of its value. And I'd also argue that even if the Russians take Bakhmut, it doesn't really change much as far as the war goes. I'm sure it would be a psychological blow for the Ukrainians, but they would still take solace, I think, in the Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensives. The Russians would be faced with advancing on Sloviansk and Kramatorsk shore, but that's no easy feat. Even months ago, when it looked for sure as if those cities were going to be attacked from multiple directions at once, their fall was not at all certain. Even 8 months ago, pro-Russian commentators were describing Sloviansk and Kramatorsk as fortresses that would be incredibly difficult to take, and that was on the assumption they'd be coming at them from multiple directions. And even that scenario, I'd argue, is a bit of a dream, because a lot of the pro-Russian sources are saying that, yes, ground is being taken, but just wait a minute, it's going to be a long while yet before we actually take Bakhmut proper. After months of heavy fighting, they've only just gotten into the town itself. They've been fighting through the outskirts so far, so there's a lot of fighting left to do yet. I'm aware that I have a very particular lens when I'm analysing a situation. I am focused on the defence economic side. I'm focused on the resources that are being committed. But from that perspective, I will make this statement. The Bakhmut offensive seems to me to be so mismatched in terms of the resources committed versus the results achieved that it makes Gallipoli look like a good idea. Now, throughout this video, I've been using very generic terms like high casualties or great cost. I haven't really attempted to put a number on it. And the problem with doing that, of course, is we have a pretty thick fog of war situation, a battle that is still ongoing, and an internet information space that is absolutely choked with different estimates. To illustrate the point for a moment, let's talk about estimates of overall Ukrainian casualties over the course of the war since 24th of February. The Ukrainian government, let's start with their MOD estimate, 13,000 killed in the Ukrainian army. Now, that's not all of the Ukrainian military, but 13,000 killed in the Ukrainian army. You look at what Ukrainian reporters, frontline sources are saying, their estimates tend to be a little bit higher because they tend to factor in other organisations, the National Guard, other battalions and organisations as well. EU-NATO estimates from late November, 100,000 killed plus wounded on the Ukrainian side. Sergei Shoigu, Minister of Defence of the Russian Federation, says that Ukraine has lost 61,207 dead and 49,368 wounded. That is the official Russian position as of late September. And then you can go even further. You can go to Scott Ritter, who, again, former US military. And his line is that Ukraine has probably lost 250,000 military KIA. And then he says in the interview, you can extrapolate the wounded. Now, immediately before that, the extrapolation rate was about 2.5 times. That gives 600,000 irrecoverable wounded. That is the idea that Ukraine has lost 850,000 military casualties. If that were true, not only is the Russian Ministry of Defense massively underestimating opposing casualties, but the entire Ukrainian army is dead or wounded, and Ukraine should be conquered in a matter of days. It's just fantasy. And even though these sources continue to get it wrong, I do not expect Kharkiv to fall by the end of December, as has been predicted, for example, even though these claims would not land at all in the domestic Russian media, they keep being made and they keep sucking up oxygen. This takes up a lot of internet oxygen, but it's not very helpful for people like me that are honestly trying to get to whatever the truth of the situation is. And I do continue to be amazed by people effortlessly making statements like the Russian economy is stronger today than it was when the war began, because that's contrary to what even the Russian central bank and Rosstat is saying. Anyway, I promise I'll move on. there are some points of consensus in relation to Bakhmut. So, for example, the Russians have an artillery advantage on Bakhmut. Both sides agree on that. Both sides also agree the advantage is significantly less than it has been in previous battles that we have data for, so battles like the ones at Popasna or Syeverodonetsk and Lysychansk. Russia can't generally engage their armour directly close to the town at scale. The Wagner link channels say these are primarily infantry assaults. We see images of tanks primarily being used as indirect artillery. The Ukrainians say the same. The visual evidence is the same. So we're relatively confident in that. We have relatively good information agreed on Ukrainian rotation, so the presence of certain brigades at certain times. The Russians remark on it, the Ukrainians remark on it. So we have an understanding of roughly which units are in Bakhmut and the surrounding area at any given time. Not necessarily what strength those units were at when they went in, but certainly what the maximum possible establishment that a brigade would likely have, for example. So I take all of these, put them together, and get a rough idea of what both sides agree on. And there are other factors that you can bring into the equation if you're trying to calculate estimated casualties in Bakhmut. This is not the first time in human history that people have had to assault a fortified position, so we have some historical baselines for casualties. The other factor we really have to consider is force density, which is often forgotten. If you see photos of trenches in the First World War, like the one I've shown here, they're full of people, constantly, almost shoulder to shoulder in defensive positions, waiting to receive assaults or prepare to go on attacks, and even during periods of reduced activity, those trenches are pretty fully manned. Bakhmut just isn't packed with that many troops. The density is quite low when you consider the length of the trench system and also the number of buildings that need to be garrisoned. And that impacts what a reasonable projection of casualties might be. So once we've got all that in mind, we look at some of the reports that are coming out of Bakhmut, and we start to draw estimates. That still leaves us with a lot of uncertainty, but here's what I would put together. So far as estimates for Russian casualties, these vary wildly. 40 to 100 dead is a recent Ukrainian government estimate for Bakhmut itself. Ukrainian frontline troops tend to give much higher estimates, but they're usually including a wider area. Like we said earlier, Bakhmut is just one city. There's also a string of towns and positions around it that are also being constantly assaulted by the Russians. The Russian claims as to their own casualties, again, are wildly divergent, but those linked to Wagner seem to take pride in the high casualties and the disregard for them that they're taking, and focus instead on the damage that's being inflicted on the Ukrainians and the ground that is being taken. Russian commentators outside Wagner have repeatedly described the operation as wasteful, unnecessary, and in some cases stupid, which gives us a little bit of a clue as to what the Russian casualty range might be. Reliable Ukrainian casualty estimates are also very hard to find because it includes questions over what constitutes a casualty, how wide an area are you considering, and how active is the front recently at the time the estimate is given. There are statements that have been put out by medics operating around Bakhmut that suggest that at the very least the composition of Ukrainian casualties is different from the Russian one. There are estimates anywhere from 24 to 400 Ukrainian casualties a day, depending on area and activity at the front, but also a much higher proportion of wounded than the Russian are suffering. Most of the Ukrainian casualties are from artillery fire, shrapnel, minor injuries. Medics talk about 160 per day, for example, one medic saying that the medics would be treating at Bakhmut, and about 90% of those can be saved. And if you've headed to the medical evacuation point, you've already crossed a threshold as to how serious your wound is. An interview with members of the American Mozart group that are active in Bakhmut suggested that over the course of a rotation, there might be 70% casualties in a unit. Given that we know a rotation in Bakhmut can last for months, all of that kind of squares together. None of that gives us a particularly firm answer, and it will be some time before we have certainty on this point. But if I had to place a bet, my observation would be that Ukrainian casualties vary wildly based on the intensity and frequency of the Russian attacks. There may be days where Ukrainian casualties spike, perhaps even above Russian ones, but the Russian percentage of killed is much, much higher, and I expect the overall patterns probably favour Ukraine. And there are many reasons that's likely to be the case. The cause of injury is likely to be different. Ukrainian medevac points are in the town of Bakhmut, which is in some case literally meters behind the defensive line, as opposed to Russian troops, which has to pull back further in order to get medical support. And of course, as Wagner confirms, troops are not allowed to retreat without orders unless they are severely wounded. So either an attack succeeds, in which case casualties are likely to be high in terms of killed and wounded, or it fails, in which case only the wounded are allowed to retreat, and those who retreat without becoming wounded can be summarily executed. Now, even though Russian and Ukrainian sources both refer to those sort of extreme measures, it may be an exaggeration, but what isn't an exaggeration is that
Infantry assaults against fortified positions are always going to be difficult, casualty-increasing affairs, and there's no indication the Russian military has found a solution to that old military problem.
So having spent far too long talking about why maybe smashing infantry into a fortified position day after day might not be the best idea, I thought I'd instead zoom out and look at some of the lessons we might be able to take out of the fighting so far, both at Bakhmut and elsewhere, and also some clue as to the role fortifications and defences might play in the war to come. The first is that war in Ukraine is showing a tendency to revert back to attrition. When neither side has enough combat power to force breakthroughs and maintain manoeuvre, the battle tends to slow down, both sides tend to entrench, and movements tend to slow as a result. Why? Because digging a trench is a really effective thing with a low barrier to entry. It's very easy to accrue defensive advantages. Give a man a shovel and time to dig a fighting position, and suddenly he's a lot more combat effective than multiple infantrymen trying to attack his position. Once you get into an attritional fight, eventually one side gets beaten down to the point where there is now a mismatch in combat power, or there's a gap in the opposing line. So attrition puts in place the situation that then allows a return to mobility. Enough of one side has been destroyed, so there are gaps in their line, therefore mobility returns, until the attacker burns out some of their combat power, hits new fortifications, and you move back to attrition. The default position is attrition. And when I was preparing this, my resident expert also noted that the quality of the entrenchment, and also things like how you disperse your ammunition, very clearly matters. The next point is the absolute omnipresence of drones on the front line, in particular really cheap drones and drones equipped with thermal imagers. Just about every source on both sides agrees that there's a constant need for more drones. These things have massive attrition rates. Apparently the average survival time for a small drone in Ukraine is maybe 3 flights. And yet drones are absolutely critical to everything. They spot for artillery, they spot attacking forces and enable infantry to respond. There's a constant barrage of so-called Volgovids, which is named after the type of grenade, where drones are shown dropping 40mm grenades on troops in defensive positions as a constant source of harassment and attrition. We've even seen some drones used to ram into other drones in order to prevent them being a problem. My resident expert noted there's probably a few lessons to learn here, including the question of how do you adapt entrenchments in order to deal with more overhead threats, i.e. the risk of a drone dropping a 40mm grenade on you. And given that now pretty much everyone has access to cheap, affordable reconnaissance in the form of these little drones, how do you disperse your ammunition, your logistics, your supplies so the hit on a single node doesn't cause a significant issue? It is fair to say that the fighting around Bakhmut has some characteristics of World War I battles, but I'm pretty sure World War I battles didn't have people launching quadcopters over the Kaiser's lines in order to drop hand grenades. And as good as the Imperial German gunners were, I'm pretty sure they couldn't match the kind of precision now realised with precision artillery ammunition. Another factor that I don't often see noted on YouTube, but which a number of Ukrainians I talked to remarked on, is that mines are the worst. Mines are terrible and mines are absolutely everywhere. We've got a lot of evidence of landmines being used in a couple of ways. The first is in an unsupervised setting where there's no one watching the mine, but you set out a minefield hoping to just inflict some attrition or make it more difficult for someone to move through some territory. What we have seen on occasion is minefields that may be unsupervised used in combination with so-called trip flares. In that video, for example, as that Russian tank with the mine roller is moving through the minefield, one of the first things it hits is a trip flare, which fires a flare up into the sky to alert the Ukrainian defenders to the fact that, well, something just triggered the trip flare. Now, Sergeant Cates noted that while tripping a flare on the attack isn't necessarily a deal breaker, one thing that was seen in Afghanistan was the use of trip flares in conjunction with command-detonated IEDs. That is, when someone sees the flare goes up, they hit the button and an IED detonates. Open question as to whether or not there's any of that happening in Ukraine. Although I wouldn't put it past Western instructors to pass on some of those techniques to the Ukrainians. The other way of using landmines is to screen defensive positions, where the minefield is in physical view of the defenders or ranged by artillery, and the intention is to slow the attacker down so that they can then be destroyed by the defences. As the sergeant put it, clearing minefields under fire is a wretched time even if you have a mine-clearing line charge, because you still have to proof, that is, check and prove that there are no mines left in the corridor once you've created that corridor. Doing that without specialised equipment, and I think it's safe to say that your average Wagner penal unit probably doesn't have specialised equipment, is almost certainly a recipe for a lot of casualties. Which I take as a polite way of saying that it's difficult to watch where you step when someone is shooting at you. And the interesting thing is that mines in Ukraine can end up in places that you wouldn't think mines could end up, because both sides have access to artillery-deployed mine systems. So you don't need engineers to go out and plant mines by hand. You can have artillery or rocket systems physically launch mines into an area in order to cover it with scatterable munitions. Clearing those mines is really difficult. Clearing infantry out of fortified structures is very difficult. And clearing fortified structures screened by minefields, well, that's extraordinarily difficult. Both sides do have specialized equipment designed to break through minefields and fortifications, but not necessarily an unlimited supply of them, which means some units may find themselves having to deal with fortifications and mines without specialized equipment. When I asked Sergeant Cates what a unit should do in that situation, he came back to me saying I would try to do anything else to avoid the obstacle and try and get my hands on an APOBS or MCLC, which is specialized equipment. You've got a mine-clearing line charge there on the screen. Basically, it fires out a whole line of explosives that blasts a corridor through a minefield. That one, of course, is one of the vehicles supplied by the US to Ukraine. But in places like Bakhmut, it's very hard to use vehicles like this because it's hard for vehicles to get close to the front line, because of the role of drone-spotted artillery and anti-armor weapons. If the density of fortifications and minefields continues to increase, so for example, if Russia continues expanding on its new Wagner Line, or if Ukraine creates even more extensive defenses around Bakhmut or an objective the Russians need to take, then there's probably going to be a need to look at new options to assure breaching. If, for example, there aren't enough trained crews or vehicles to go around, then another option might be the APOBS. That's an obstacle breaching system that can be operated by two individuals and is carried in what looks like a backpack, as opposed to the larger systems that are mounted on armoured vehicles. If you can't get an M113 or a UR-77 up to the front, then maybe you can give the infantry a couple of those things. And speaking of Russian defences, this is probably where I want to close this presentation out, because I'm not sure enough attention is being paid to this phenomenon. While the world focuses on Bakhmut, Russia is establishing a chain of strong points and defences running well behind its existing defensive lines. In Kherson Oblast, the line of defences, you see some of them on the screen there, run all the way back to Crimea, and indeed there are some being built in Crimea itself. Over in the Donbass, the line, which is also mockingly called by people like Strelkov the Surovikin line, actually doesn't run along the front, it runs through the middle of Luhansk Oblast, suggesting that it's not intended to defend at least half of the territory they currently hold, or approximately half the territory. And these positions aren't just ditches in the dirt, they include some pre-built fortifications, although admittedly in some cases a ditch might be more effective, because a lot of the defences being built are pretty underwhelming. Looking at that truck there in the image, for example, you see a truck effortlessly holding two of these pre-built concrete bunkers. Now, the sergeant noted the advantage of a bunker like that is positioning. You can put it anywhere in order to overlook some other defences. The problem, of course, is that's not very thick concrete. It's going to be vulnerable to a whole bunch of heavy incoming, and at that thickness, it's probably even vulnerable to a 40mm grenade dropped from a drone. In some cases, people are also laughing at those little pyramidal structures there are called dragon's teeth, and they're intended to reduce the mobility of armoured vehicles. You're not meant to be able to drive an armoured vehicle over them. The problem is in a lot of cases, these are being installed without being dug into the ground. The quality doesn't seem great to the point where some are already showing sign of weathering, and in some cases, they're being put in place with, for example, handles showing so that they're relatively easy to remove. There's even a video of a Ukrainian armoured vehicle driving straight over some of these, so not the most formidable defences ever unless they're paired with, for example, landmines, barbed wire, and covering fire. As the sergeant noted, if defences like these aren't covered by defenders, then all you're really doing is giving a learning experience to the opposing army in how to clear them. But I wouldn't be so quick to rule out Russia's defensive efforts because there's always an opportunity for these fortifications to be improved. We're seeing heavier and heavier bunkers that, yes, are still very vulnerable to high-caliber weapons, but are at least resistant to small arms and 40mm. There's a chance for them to integrate minefields, anti-tank ditches, concertina wire, and other defences to make what would otherwise be not the most impressive defence on the planet at least something for containing the movement of the enemy. And all of it is likely an improvement over nothing, and that was the Kharkiv problem. Once the Ukrainians got through the Russian lines, there was precious little to contain the breakout. Even relatively limited fixed defences might be enough to take some of the momentum out of future Ukrainian assaults, although even I can't find a justification for sand trenches in Crimea. In conclusion, large parts of the war in Ukraine are now focused on entrenchment and defensive battles to hold those entrenchments. That doesn't mean the war is a stalemate, it just means the war is moving slowly in territorial terms. The battle for Bakhmut is a fascinating, horrifying microcosm of that wider pattern, but I would argue it's not worth the resources that the Russians have directed towards its capture. The battle there is more nuanced than the idea that Russia is just sending solid human wave assaults of disposable prisoners at impenetrable defences, but at the same time it is an incredibly costly exercise in men and materiel, with relatively little to show for it. Beyond Bakhmut, while it's important not to overlearn the lessons of the Ukraine war and assume that every war is going to look like this one, there may potentially be some lessons there for future conflicts in terms of how you disperse your supplies and ammunition, the omnipresence of drones, what makes for an effective fortification, and the tendency to draw back to attritional fighting if there isn't an overmatch in capability and combat power. That might mean changes to training patterns, it might mean larger war stocks of ammunition to support attritional fighting, or it might just mean making sure that troops get really good entrenching tools. Because even though we live in a world with satellite-based reconnaissance and hypersonic missiles, it seems there's a significant place on the battlefield still for a man in a ditch with the will to defend it. Alright, channel update to close out. First, a thanks to all those who contributed to this segment, both those of you in Ukraine and also to Sergeant Cates of the United States Marine Corps for his commentary from the point of view of a combat engineer. With regards to charity payments, as I said last week, the United 24 payment, that was made as planned and the next one is going out this week. I'm looking next, after this is done, at the potential provision to charities that are looking at providing generators to civilians in particular because of the recent blackouts and the effect that's having on the civilian population, but I'll keep my patrons apprised on that front. Next week is likely to be an early release in terms of the video where we're looking at 6th generation aircraft programs. The reason that's likely to release early is because obviously Sunday in Australia is Christmas, and I won't be releasing on Christmas, so I'm going to release either a day or two early. It remains to be seen exactly when. Thank you all for your support throughout the year, and I'll see you all again next week.